Welcome to the Ministry Company Podcast. You're listening to Pastor Mike Hepburn from the Ministry Company Church in London, Ontario, Canada. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at The Ministry Company.
All right, so we're continuing along Nehemiah, and I'm gonna kind of do a little bit of a jump back in between chapters 1 and 2, and then go over chapter 2 a little bit again, because I think we got about halfway through it last week. And then just because Pastor Pavel and I are reading different books and going through different things, there's a little bit of complementary stuff and stuff that crosses over, but a little bit different too. So, with Nehemiah chapter 1, if we were to do a close note quick, we know that the men come from Jerusalem, and Nehemiah asks them what's happening in Jerusalem, how is the temple, how are the people, and he gets this bad report, and he ends up weeping and crying out to the Lord. And if I were to do a very quick close note of that, I would say Pastor Powell had mentioned how much he cared at one point when he was talking, and just going with that word that he cared as a character trait or as a leadership trait. First of all, that he cared enough to ask. A lot of times we live in that culture where you ask people how they're doing, but it's just that quick glazed over, oh, I'm good, how are you? Good. But he cared enough to ask, and he wanted the real answer. He wasn't looking for a sugar-coated version or anything like that. And we know he gets, in verse 3 it says, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. And so that leads to the next form of his care. It's that he cared enough to weep. So we know right after that it says that he wept for days, that he mourned for days. And as a character trait or as a leadership trait, having that ability to mourn over something that is grieving to the Lord, it's grieving to those around you, is important, which led him into caring enough to pray, which we had covered in good detail with Pastor Pavlo as well, how he had that prayer to the Lord that went through all these various different steps of, having a connection to, well, it's not just that Israel sinned, I have my part in it as well. My family line has their part in it. And then calling out on those promises. And then one more thing I would say for caring is that he cared enough to volunteer. So when he gets to the end, he has that call of, you can use me to bring this to what it should be, that I'm available to be used. And then, so we had covered this last week, how there's such a big gap between chapter 1 and chapter 2, where there's not really much that's talked about. It doesn't really say anything about it, but we know that it was several months between the two chapters. And we can really see how it was his relationship with the Lord, and it was that prayer that held him fast during that time, that he wasn't worrying. We know he was in the presence of the king multiple times over those 4 months, and it wasn't until that 4 or 5 month mark where it was visible on his face that he was distraught because of it. So that prayer time with the Lord, that fasting time with the Lord, is what kind of kept him in a place where he wasn't being revealed to the king as in mourning or as in distress until it was divinely timed by the Lord. So yeah, I would say it all starts with a man who cares, and that's a leadership trait, that's a character trait that we can look at from Nehemiah and look to develop that in ourselves as well. You almost see Nehemiah as somebody like a Joseph or a Moses who was set in the right place at the right time by God, that divine placement in almost like Esther too, where we have that famous verse, that maybe I was put in such a place for such a time as this. We can see that in Nehemiah as well, that he wasn't really anybody, like as far as family lines go, it's not like he's labeled as somebody who was of like a high importance in the lineage of Israel, or that his family was like, we see the lineages throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, and it's not like his is one of those that shines as like out of the line of David or out of the line of the line of prophets or the line of the Levites, priests. He's just a regular guy like any of us, and he was just doing what would be a regular job as being the king's cupbearer. So with that December to April, he just learned that patience of waiting. His body didn't show his burden because it had been left to God in prayer. So what I see in the first part of chapter 2, we read it last week, so we won't read the whole thing again, but we see how his faith was built up through his relationship and through those prayers. And the first of one was, we just kind of talked about, it's his faith to wait. We know in that 4 months, he didn't show his hand, he didn't go out of time. We have that ability to act on emotions, act on feelings, and do things that, to put us doing the right thing, but in the wrong time or in the wrong attitude, the wrong season. And it was his faith to wait was what held him until that proper time. When the king sees him and says, "Why is your face so sad?" It's that time that the God had divinely appointed. And then when the king asks him that is when we see that he has the faith to ask. He doesn't say, "Oh, I'm fine." Again, that care. He cared enough to actually answer the king honestly. And it says he cared enough to ask. And one thing I saw in that is that in the presence of faith, it doesn't mean the absence of organization. And we kind of covered that last week as well with Pastor Pablo, where he was prepared to give the king very specific things that he needed, that he wanted to see happen. And that was part of that faith in asking. So we see in verse 7 and 8, I'll read, he said, "And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy. And the king granted me what I asked for the good hand of my God was upon me." So he had been praying and he had been planning. Proverbs 16:9 says, trusting God, or it says, I should read that verse, my other Bible. You want to read that one? Sure.
The heart of a man plans his ways, but the Lord establishes his steps.
So that's what we see, that he'd been planning that way, and now the Lord is establishing those steps by giving him access to the king, giving him, the king's full attention. When I was studying this, one phrase I came across is one that they used during the Civil War. The soldiers had this saying, it was trust in God and keep your powder dry, where it was that they were always prepared at any moment to be engaged in a battle, that they were actively praying, they were actively seeking the Lord, but they were also prepared for when that time came of battle, that they were ready to go. So he was already thinking of the obstacles. He was thinking of, the people in between the city he was in and Jerusalem that might be hesitant to let him through or be hesitant to help him without the king's consent, and he had everything laid out ahead of time before he left. And we saw last week, I think this is kind of where we left off in verses 9 and 10, where we see him come against opposition. He sees Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite, and how they had been displeased by what he was trying to do or what he was setting out to accomplish. And we see there that faith will always have opposition, that when you're seeing something that the Lord's placed in you, a vision or a purpose, that the people who don't see it or the people who are opposed to it, they're going to come out of the woodworks and they're going to be negative. And a lot of times those might be the very people that you were hoping would be there to help you or to be beside you in doing it. But part of having that faith is being prepared to come against that opposition and know what the Lord has called you to do and what he's established for you. So one thing in my studies I came across is 4 principles of preparation. And the first one is that we realize our limits. So for the sake of Nehemiah, that was that he didn't try to change the heart of the king, that he didn't go right when he heard what was happening in Jerusalem to try and plead on, as the Israelites' case, to the king and change his heart and cause him to move. He waited and let God change Pharaoh's heart. We don't try to change people or manipulate. We let God take care of it. And I think one thing we see in chapter 2 that I think was divinely timed is that the queen was there when Nehemiah showed his sorrow, and the king approached him about it, because part of the job of the queen, or part of the influence of the queen, is that a lot of the times the king would actually, when they were in the king's presence, they would be an advisor, and the king would take a side note with the queen and ask her opinion, ask her advice. And it's very likely that the queen was instrumental in having that compassion towards the Israelites and towards Nehemiah's plight. So principle number 1, we realize our limits and we let God do what God's going to do. Number 2 is we turn to God, and that's in praying. And praying and waiting go hand in hand. And we saw that where he stands firm, but he doesn't act prematurely based on emotions. Principle number 3 is organize. And like I said, faith doesn't mean disorder. It pairs with careful planning. And really, faith breeds organization, because when you're truly having faith about something, then it's that hope and that expectation. And when you expect something, you start planning for that, right? So faith in action is organization and planning. Vision sees the steps. So a lot of times, maybe we'll get an idea, or we'll have faith for something. We have that phrase, like, put it on a shelf for later. And a lot of the times, I'm not saying that's wrong all the time. A lot of times, maybe, again, it's that waiting time. But when we put something on the shelf, are we aware that it's still there? Are we still planning to get back to it? Like for me, even not faith related necessarily, but as an example, like buying books. I have so many books that I've bought that I plan to read, and I put them on the shelf. And it's easy to forget that they were even there, and it's like 2 years later you go, oh, I meant to read that book, and it's been there. So I actually have a list on my phone, and it's like books to read, so that when I'm going to the next book, I can go to the book list and be like, oh, okay, that book's been on the shelf for a year, I should pull that one off and read it. Because otherwise, there's books that have been on our bookshelves for 5-7 years, never read them, right? So when we put it on the shelf, we don't forget about it. We have that understanding that it's there for a reason, and we're going to get there at some point. So that's part of organization and having that vision for the future. And number 4, we didn't quite get into this as much last week, but number 4 for principles of preparation is to press on. And that's that when opposition comes, it should really be expected. And when you're carrying out God's will, that's just part of the challenge that comes with it. What else we got here? 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 is realize limits and let God do what only God can do. Number 2 is turn to God in prayer and waiting, standing firm on what he's laid out. Number 3 is organize, so see the vision, prepare for the vision. And number 4 is press on through opposition. So I think this is pretty much where we left off last week. I think we read the rest, but we didn't really touch too much on it. So maybe I'll read from chapter 2, verse 11 to the end again real quick. It says, "So I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me but the one on which I rode. I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring and to the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down, and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. Then I went up in the night by the valley and inspected the wall, and I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing. And I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were to do the work. And then I said to them, 'You see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer suffer derision.' And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, 'Let us rise up and build.' So they strengthened their hands for the good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us and said, "What is this thing you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king?" And then I replied to them, "The God of heaven will make us prosper, and we his servants will arise and build. But you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem." And so one thing that stood out to me for this is right at the beginning, verse 11, and it says he was there for 3 days and he did nothing, right? He just kind of hung out. And seeing that in Nehemiah, a lot of times we can be so gung-ho when we actually see the ball start to roll and we see the vision coming to pass to jump out ahead or to just like get right in on it. And he got there and he just took time to catch his breath, make sure he was hearing from the Lord, spend some time in prayer. And in that we can see from a leadership point that he was very successful in knowing how to handle himself in solitude. That at that point he was literally alone. He was the only one there who knew why he was there. And he was okay with that because he was taking a time to really check in with the Lord, make sure that he was in the right mindset. And then he took time to inspect, make himself aware of the details. And one thing is that he didn't get lost in them. Again, like we remember in the first chapter, he hears about Jerusalem and he spends days in mourning and weeping. And now that he's physically seeing it with his own eyes, it's easy to fall back into that emotion of, oh, like, woe is Israel, woe is me. And we see here that he doesn't do that he sees the problems, he sees the obstacles, but he doesn't get lost in them and consumed by how big of a task he has set out before him. And he was developing a master plan that he was going to set out with all the other people. It says how he hadn't even told them what he was doing. So that groundwork, it really took place in that silence and that solitude where he knew why he had gone there and he needed to really inspect and understand how big the task was before he brought it to the others. And then this last little part, we really see that what he had in, as far as faith goes, is that he had the faith to challenge others, that he was actually going to bring this task and put it in front of them and say, this is what we need to accomplish, and God's hand is upon us, and he's with us in this. And one thing that he did, I think that was very important in verse 17, he said, "You see the trouble that we are in." And he didn't say, he hadn't been in Jerusalem. There's people that had been there for decades at this point. He could have come in and been like, "What have you guys been doing? Like, you guys should have been done this years ago." But he came in and said, "Hey guys, we're in trouble. I'm part of this too. We're in trouble." And we see that he says, "We are in," and he says, "Come, let us build the wall so that we may no longer suffer derision." So again, it's that he's identifying with them. He's including himself in that. And that's important because blaming somebody or criticizing somebody can really squelch or bring to a halt that motivation to work. But identity encourages motivation. So he identified himself with them, and he identified them with the job that God had called them to do. And one thing that I stumbled across in my studies with this is 2 types of motivation. And they're kind of big words, but one kind of motivation is called extrinsic motivation. And another word for that is external motivation. And one way of describing that would be if then. So if you do this, then this will happen. If you clean your room, then you can have a chocolate bar. If you finish your homework, then you can watch some TV. There's motivation based on something that they're going to physically get or something like a privilege that they're going to get. Whereas the next one is intrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation is an appeal to an inner person or to their identity. And we see that both of these are necessary, but how they're used is very important. And wise leaders know how to use them at the right time. They know their people and what appeals to them, and they can apply both extrinsic and intrinsic in the right combination. But one thing we see here is that he really favors that intrinsic motivation because that's what's necessary for long-term character development when you're applying when you're appealing to their identity, where it's not just about what they're going to get, but it's about who they are. It's about something that is part of them. So again, that's where we see where he identifies with them. And he says, we're going to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem so that we no longer suffer derision, so that we're not looked upon as, like that nation that failed the Lord in obeying his commands and that he deserted, but we're going to be seen as the ones that the Lord's hand is upon. Intrinsic and extrinsic, both important, but intrinsic is much better for long-term character development and for causing somebody to do it because they see the benefit for themselves, not just because they're getting something out of it. Last things I have here are the ability to handle criticism is crucial. So we see with Nehemiah, we saw earlier in the chapter, he comes across these two guys and they don't really like what he's got planned. They don't like that he's going to Jerusalem and that he's going to rebuild the city. And these same guys, plus one more, pop out towards the end when he's actually laid out before everybody else this vision. And they're criticizing him, like, are you rebelling against the king? Are you doing this, like, out of order, out of disobedience? And he was willing to take that criticism because he knew, first of all, who it was that was criticizing him, that it was somebody that wasn't willing to partner in that vision. That's where we get like this phrase constructive criticism, where it's like if somebody's with you, if they've got your back and they have something that they bring up as a criticism, it's meant not to cause that lack of motivation, but it's meant to maybe open up eyes to another thing that you hadn't seen before or cause you to think something in a different way. That's constructive criticism, and that's good, and that's how we, like the proverb, iron sharpens iron, where we use each other's, criticisms in a way to better ourselves or to see things that we hadn't seen before. So here we can see these men that are criticizing Nehemiah, they are not with him. They're opposed to everything he's trying to do. And so he can look at that criticism and he says, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we, his servants, will arise and build, but you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. So we know that he takes that criticism and he knows because of who it's coming from and why it's coming that he can just brush that to the side. He doesn't need to think about it. He doesn't need to try and apply it to his life in any way. It just needs to be put to the side. So that's the big thing I saw in chapter 2. Those 4 principles of preparation, and just that idea that we see his faith come out. We see his faith to wait. We see his faith to ask. And we see his faith to challenge others when the time comes. And we see that in that faith that he observes what's going on. He takes the time to see the vision, to prepare that vision. He plans. Because of his time in prayer and fasting, he's working in the proper timing. He's working in the proper motivation. In that faith, we see him communicating with those around him well. He's knowing when to speak up and when not to. He's knowing how to speak up, how to motivate them in a way that encourages them to follow in that vision. And we see that dedication to the task, that even though it took 4 or 5 months for it to really start rolling, that he was ready and waiting the second that he had that opportunity to act with the king, that dedication really pulled that opportunity to get to Jerusalem as quick as possible. So I guess one thing I would say, overall broad for Nehemiah, we know there's 3 roles that he carries. The first one's the king's cupbearer, which we see in chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. The second role we're going to see coming up is wall builder, where he takes that lead to see the wall rebuilt. And then third, later on, once the wall is rebuilt, he takes over that role as city governor, where he really brings the people back to a right heart with the Lord, and that the city prospers under his leadership because he brings them back to doing things the way they should be done in Jerusalem. What else we got here? Going on a more like personal spiritual level, I'd say things we can look at as far as Nehemiah in these first couple chapters is personal evaluation. And the one book I'm reading is by Chuck Swindoll. It's called Hand Me Another Brick, I think. And one thing he pointed out, he's like personally, what does your wall look like? Like in your own personal life, spiritually, what does your wall look like? And it would be easy to, we hear some visitors crawling. It would be easy to ignore cracks, right? Even in our chimney, when we moved in, we got told by our home inspector, your chimney needs to be repointed because there's some cracks that are starting to form in the, in between the bricks. And if you let that go, if you let the water have its way with it, then you're going to need to completely deconstruct and rebuild your chimney. And we could have ignored that and be like, oh, the cracks, there's just some small cracks, not a big deal. But we took that advice and we brought somebody in, they looked at it, they went up and they took the top part of our chimney and could see where there was water leaking down and down into the bricks, and that's where the cracks were coming from because there was a leak at the top. So we had the chimney repointed. And so what Chuck Swindoll is really saying is we see Nehemiah's very real, very vulnerable personal inspection of why was Israel in this place. We see that in chapter 1 where he's basically saying we have things within our nation that we need to fix, and it's not just the physical walls, it's the spiritual walls as well. So one thing Chuck Swindoll in his introduction said is that personally we can evaluate our own walls. Are they cracked? Are they falling down? And when we do that, it's just giving us an opportunity to seek the Lord and to see how it looks to rebuild that. And then he went on to reconstruction. So that's where we're getting into now in chapter 3 and 4. And what he said there is that you can't afford not to have time with God each day. That it doesn't have to look super fancy. It doesn't have to be waking up at 4 a.m. every morning and praying for an hour and reading for an hour. That consistency is really what's key. It's if it can only be 10 minutes to start, then it's better to do 10 minutes every day than to do an hour once a month and then not have any more time with the Lord, personal, introspective time with him. Even the physical, we see that where it's like you can't eat one big meal at the beginning of the week and expect to survive the rest of the week just hoping that meal holds you over, right? It's consistency. We have to consistently eat something to nourish our bodies. So that reconstruction looks like that, being in a consistent place with the Lord. And then the number 3 that he kind of said there was after reconstruction comes perseverance, and we'll see that as they have that opposition or as they have pushback. You start building and it starts to go well, and then you come across some things that don't go as they're planned and you want to stop working. It's having that perseverance. And one quote that I came across that kind of touches on that is that the bias of nature, human nature, is always toward the wilderness, that we have that understanding to explore, to want to go out and do things. And it's never really toward the fruitful field. And what he means by that is that, the field takes work. You think foraging, you can go into the woods and you can look for things to eat, but it's going to be not a lot of fantastic things. You might find some mushrooms or some wild berries. Not a lot of work involved, and you'll get some food, but it's not going to be the best. Whereas the fruitful field, you have to plow the field, you have to plant the field, you have to make sure that it's getting the proper water. There's a lot of waiting and praying that you get the right rain and the right dry times and all that. But at the end of the day, that perseverance of planting the field and tending to the field offers you up a much better fruit than you would just find in the wilderness. So I think as a whole, we'll see that as we continue to go through. We'll see that he's done that evaluation. We're just getting into that reconstruction. And we'll have to see that perseverance, and we can apply that to our spiritual lives as well, where we find those cracks in our own lives. We take the time, the effort to be in the Lord's presence, to pray, to read our Bibles, to reconstruct that wall. And we plant the field. We do the hard work and not just forage for the stuff in the wilderness.
You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at The Ministry Company. Or join us in person at 1541 Fanshawe Park Road East, London, Ontario, on Sundays at 12:30 p.m. or Wednesday nights for prayer at 7 p.m.